All right, we're going to get started. Good morning, everybody. Hello and welcome to today's GROW session entitled Memory and Memory Enhancement in Medieval Ashkenaz with Dr. Susan Einbinder. Got it? Yes. My name is Terry Swartz-Russell, and I'm one of the Program and Relationship Directors on the Tamid team of Hebrew College. I also want to note that we have two other team members with us, Robin Kahn and Laura Tarlin. So if you see their names in a box, you'll know who they are. We are thrilled to be with you today for our November GROW session. GROW sessions are designed to be opportunities for participants to gather, reflect, observe, and wrestle with important topics relevant to our lives today through a Jewish lens. We're in for a great treat today as we consider the role of memory and how Jews in medieval times use different techniques for recall, sometimes something very important in the time since it was a key to social status as religious authority, and there was an emphasis on study. During today's sessions, we'll consider how the persistence of these rituals in Jewish life shed light on our Jewish attitudes towards learning and how they may differ from modern emphases. As we go through the session, please feel free to put questions and reflections into the chat. Make sure it goes to the group so that we can monitor it. Questions will be taken at the end of this presentation. However, Dr. Einbinder will pause for clarification during her talk. So we also ask that everybody please remain on mute during the presentation. And before we begin our session, I'd like to tell you a bit about our presenter. Susan L. Einbinder is Professor Emerita of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut, where she taught from 2012 to 2023, following a long career at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Over her career, Dr. Einbinder has specialized in the literary records of medieval Jews in crisis, publishing 4 books and many articles on topics ranging from the persecution and expulsion of medieval French Jews to Jewish experience in the Black Death and later plague outbreaks in Spain, Italy, and Northern Africa. Dr. Einbinder's work has been supported with fellowships from a number of institutions, including Princeton University's Davis Center, the National Humanities Center, and the Guggenheim Foundation. And she has been elected a member of the Medieval Academy of America and the American Academy for Jewish Research. She lives in Providence, Rhode Island, and is currently a visiting scholar in religious studies at Brown University. So we welcome Dr. Einbinder and all of you this morning. And Dr. Einbinder, take it away.
Wow, that was efficient, except I do say Einbinder. But
after all that, I got it
after
wrong.
all that, but see, memory enhancement. But so I'm very glad to be here today from not so far away in Providence, depending where you are. But and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to talk about something that I've taught for many years and thought about for many years, and look forward to sharing with you. It's obviously a different format to do this on Zoom than to do it in person with students. I'll confess right before we start that usually this is a multimedia show for me when I teach it in a live classroom, and I bring some of the essential props like hard-boiled eggs and memory cakes with angels' names on them. But I'll leave you to, concoct those on your own afterwards. I'm giving you some instructions, but my goals, I like to kind of give you my goals a bit first so that you know where I'm going. And the first goal is pretty basic. It's really a historical goal. I just want to acquaint you with some literary and ritual evidence of memory enhancing practices that go way back to late antique Jewish communities, right? The Byzantine period, like say the 5th century in the Near East, and to medieval Ashkenaz, right? Germany, Northern France, and the connections that between them, because they are not separate phenomenon. phenomena. And I also want to focus on the medieval ritual, which is because I'm a medievalist, and it's an Ashkenazi ritual, and it came to really just it's centered on a little boy's first day at school and his introduction to the alphabet, right? To learning to read. And it's quite an elaborate ceremony, and it flourished for part of the Middle Ages, only pretty much in Ashkenaz and some in France, and then it sort of disappears and is replaced by the bar mitzvah, right? So I'll be pointing that way a bit, and looking at some of the symbolic meanings that that were packed into this ceremony and its connection to some of these memory practices. And then maybe as a kind of meta reflection, I will be thinking about how that, and asking you to think about by analogy and contrast, I mean, how our own pedagogical methods and educational systems, right, really emphasize very different kinds of learning. And those are the sort of tiered goals. And as I said, this material comes from a unit in a course that I taught for many years, both in Cincinnati at the Hebrew Union College and at the University of Connecticut and at Brown, actually. And so it's not really original research. It's not something I've published on, but how I put it together is obviously my own. And I'm relying pretty strongly on two books. I'm going to see how brilliantly I can share this PowerPoint for a second here. Right, and let's see if we can do this. Lost this. All right, I can't get to this. Thank you. There we go. All right, so these are the books. The early rituals, right from the Byzantine period, Scholastic Magic, Ritual and Revelation, and Early Jewish Mysticism by Michael Schwartz. And you'll see some nice sort of magical writing on there, and there's a good demon or angel or something. And you'll notice if you have any Hebrew, you can see the alphabet there, right? Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, right? So somebody was practicing, right? And over here on the right, Ivan Marcus's Rituals of Childhood, which is a book specifically about the ritual that I will be talking about. And you can see the little boy sitting on his teacher's lap with his Jew hat, right? That's very Ashkenazi iconography. And he's holding his egg and his cake, and so are the other little boys, right? And we'll get to that and what it means, right? Both of those books were published in the late 1990s, 1996, and that was a period when Jewish studies really saw a wave of new work that was bringing an anthropological lens to the Jewish past, right? That was pretty new. And one of the advantages of that anthropological lens was that it enabled scholars to really level the old distinction between elite and popular practices. And that was sort of the way that people had very crudely divided up a lot of Jewish texts and beliefs, right? So once you didn't have that division anymore, you could suddenly see all kinds of other people, right? Like women and children and servants, poor people, artisans, right? And also beliefs, right? And practices that maybe the rabbis were more reticent or didn't want to write about or didn't want to write much about. And so they kind of fell off the page when were invisible to view. Anthropology, of course, includes a study of ritual, and a focus on rituals really has transformed our understanding of pre-modern Jewish life. So even prayer in this perspective can be understood as a ritual form, right? And it's certainly part of rituals, right? Ceremonies and services, right? And prayers take place in special settings. They enlist music, right? Sounds, props, body movements, right? Food sometimes, smells and symbols, right? And so even when people, as you know from your own experience, right? Even when people who don't necessarily understand Hebrew, right? Or don't necessarily understand the words to what they're saying, are repeating those words. All those other factors, the setting, the sound, the smells, right? The performance, right? Can create a very powerful experience, right? And that's that collective multimedia, multi-sensory experience is much more in view now than it used to be. So that said, there's kind of a limit to what we can do in 45 minutes, but I've added some text for us to look at, and I think that you'll get them to keep tomorrow, right? And but today we're going to share them on the screen so you I can point to them as I go. And I'm going to start, as I suggested, right before the Middle Ages, and with a collection of late antique mystical writings from Babylonia and ancient Palestine. And these are associated with the palace or chariot mystics, right? The Hechalot or the Merkava mystics, right? And specialists in early Jewish mysticism, like Michael Schwartz, who wrote that book, right? Disagree about who exactly these people were and how mainstream they were, right? Although Michael repeatedly makes the point, especially with these rituals, right, that even their more bizarre practices that are straight out magic in some ways, right, have are very much in support of traditional social values, right? Learning is a value of the rabbis, and these guys are teaching you how to do it better, right? So they're not saying forget books, drop out of school, you know, be a hippie, right? They're not saying that, right? They're saying we can shortcut or do this more efficiently, right? So they're not anti-establishment guys. The visionary practices that gave them their name, chariot mystics, like the Merkava mystics or Hechalot, the palace mystics, come from, as far as we know, they had these sort of very, my students used to love this, right? They would fast, well, that part they didn't like, but I mean, that would fast for several days, and then they would spin around, right, in circles, and then sit down and put their head between their knees. Well, that'll give you a vision, right? And if you'd ever tried that as a child, right? And they did have visions, but the visions that they would cultivate involved ascending, which they called descending, right? It's a euphemism. So they called it the descent through the seven heavens to gaze upon the chariot throne of God, right? Who's on top, right, in the seventh heaven. And in order, every layer of heaven that you went through had its own legions of angels that kind of police that level of heaven. And you had to conjure them to get safely through, right? And this use of angel names, right? So they're really kind of incantations or spells. You would have to call on the angels to make them let you through. That is a very standard hallmark characteristic of what we call Jewish magic, right? You can't order God around. Even a magician doesn't want to do that, right? But you can go for the lower employees, right? So you can go for the, you know, the secretaries and the clerks, right? So you can boss them around, like the poor person on the 800 line, right? That you scream at, right? And so this grabbing, sort of making the angel do your will by summoning the angel by name is a very Jewish magic idea. The examples that you'll see in your handout, and I'll let Robin put it back up, or it was Laura put it back up there for me. our early testimony to another category of Merkava practice, and that was they were stymied by the need, right? Every good Jewish boy rabbinic student, right, had to memorize lots of text. And it's not so easy, right, for them, or I mean, they had better memories than we do, but it was not so easy for them either. And they came up with a solution to that problem, which was supernatural intervention, right? Grab the angel who's in charge of learning and make that angel, right, help you, right? And so there are two angels who are the star players in these texts. One is called the Sar HaTorah, right? The Prince of Torah. And the other one, and that angel, the Prince of Torah, right, is in charge of Torah learning. And then there's a counter angel, a kind of meaner guy called Potach, right, who's the angel in charge of forgetfulness. And then there are lots of other angels, right? Actually, back up, Laura, right back to the beginning, and you'll see exactly what the sort of plot line of these rituals is, right? And the Sar HaTorah is going to be summoned to grant what the prayers call, these rituals call P'tichat Halev, opening of the heart, right? And there's a big blur between heart and mind in ancient Hebrew, right? They thought you thought out of your heart, right? So it's basically asking for a good memory, right? And I've given you two early versions of this, of the same ritual, right? And you can see it's put in a kind of narrative form where Rabbi Ishmael says, when I was 13 years old, right? Rabbi Nechunya saw me, I was in big trouble, right? He says, a scriptural passage I was reading one day, I would forget the next. A Mishnaic passage I was repeating one day, I would forget the next. So he panics. What do we do when we can't remember what we study, right? I saw that the Torah was not sticking, right? It wasn't remaining. I took hold of myself. I refrained from eating, drinking, bathing, anointing. I deprived myself of sex. Michael Schwartz does point out that this is a good indication that this is a made-up narrative, because a 13-year-old is probably not needing to deprive himself of sex, right? But then or now. So it's really an adult prescription here, but it's being framed as a story of a young person, right? I didn't sing or laugh, nor, so, and immediately his teacher, right, grabs him and brings him into the temple, right, the chamber of hewn stone. And here you see the magic part, and he swears by the great seal, and then you have these angels, right, Zechuriel, Zecher, remember, right, who is Metatron, the chief angel, probably, right? And when you grab that angel by repeating its name, the angel reveals the praxis of the secret of Torah. And immediately my heart was enlightened, right? My eyes gazed into the depths and paths of Torah, and I never forgot anything ever again, right? So it's a great trick, right? And if we scroll down a little more, you'll see in the other version, you get a whole blast of angel names, right? See all those capital letters. They're basically just reams of consonants that show up in the Hebrew, right? And nobody really knows how to put them together, but you can see all the ale at the end of some of them, right? But the idea is, you get all of these angels on board, and then they're going to now same ending, right? I never forgot anything ever again, right? So that's the essence of the ritual. And you'll notice that these rituals are ascetic, right? They involve deprivation to prepare for this conjuring, right? You fast, right? You deprive yourself of food. You deprive yourself of society, right? You deprive yourself of sex. And And we will see that the medieval ritual actually goes 180 degrees in the other direction, right? And it adds special foods and it adds special public kind of communal performance, right? Nonetheless, they are related. Some of the same kinds of thinking and the same text lines sometimes actually move. And that's really not a surprise. If any of you is a historian of medieval Ashkenaz, you'll know, right, that that the Jews of medieval Ashkenaz uniquely in some ways, right, preserved texts and traditions from southern Italy that went back to Eretz Yisrael, right, ancient Palestine and Babylonia, more than the other European Jewish communities. They didn't always know what they had, right, but they collected this stuff and they repeated it and treasured it and passed it on. So over time, some of that stuff is going to end up in 12th century Ashkenaz and morph into a very different kind of ceremony, but still very concerned with the problem of memory, right? So we know, right, that study, I mean, we've heard this since we were children, probably, right? That study is important to Jews, right? And one of the reasons, very pragmatically, right, is that the scholar class that said so in the first place, right, and who defined and regulated the practices and behavior of Jewish communities, right? They were scholars, right? They were readers. So that's what the cultural capital was that really counted for advancement in the system, right? And with it, the better a scholar you were, the more you acquired institutional prestige, right? Communal prestige and authority, political authority, power, right? But even though we are aware of that, right, and we have it has evolved into a kind of long tradition of reverence for learning, right? We rarely ask what other Jewish times and contexts thought study actually entailed, right? And for the early rabbis, study, when they talk about, study, 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 they're not necessarily talking about ideas, right? Or concepts or synthesizing material, right? Those are pretty much modern Western ideas of how we study and learn, right? They're really talking about rote memorization. And specifically the rote memorization of core Jewish texts of the Hebrew scriptures, right? The Bible, the liturgy, the prayers, right? And then Mishnah, and then Talmud, right? The more you went to school, right, the more you could memorize, right? And the accepted philosophy of education was very simple: memorize first, and you can understand later, right? They were not. It's really very, very different from our idea of like you've got to understand this, and then like the memorization isn't so important, right? And that explains somewhat, right, the very exhausted frustration of Rabbi Ishmael in that Hechalot narrative, right? I mean, he's studying, he's memorizing. The next day he gets up and he can't remember anything, right? And so it's really very different from our meaning of study, right? And from its very beginnings, when the rabbis, their curriculum for young boys was geared to the graduated memorization of increasingly difficult texts, right? So you just moved from one stage to the other. And Marcus is very interested in this sort of shift, but initially in Ashkenaz, right, all they cared about was the age, really, right? Like you turned 5, you started, right? It didn't matter if you were a mature 5 or an immature 5, right? Like you just started, right? You went from one stage to the other. There's a precedent for this, right? It's not really from the original Mishnah. Apparently it's a later addition, but it's a pseudo-Mishnaic text in the end of chapter 5 of Mishnah Avot, Parak 21, right? It actually gives you the ages for each level of study, right? It says when you're 5, you start memorizing Bible. When you're 10, you start memorizing Mishnah, right? When you're 13, you start memorizing all the commandments. And when you're 15, you start Talmud, right? That's a lot of memorizing, right? And again, this idea, I'll show you, let's see, let me get back to my pictures again. You can see, oh, always get stuck here. All right. I need that black thing at the top to move. Thank you. Oh, it's always. Ah. Okay, here we go. Right, right here you can actually see, I can't get under your banner at the top there, but this is actually from the Geniza, right? But you see, it's a children's primer, right, for learning the alphabet. And you have all those alepphs, and they have different vowels under them, right? So that you would learn a, right? Then ba, be, be, right? Until you went through the whole alphabet, right? And you could also see this in later form, right? Same exact format, right? This is a wall chart, so your mother could stick this up in the kitchen and you could practice, right? This is from the 17th century, and it was published in Venice, right? But and I believe this original is actually, yes, it's in the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, right? But you'll see there's the alphabet chart all the way across, right? Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, right? And then just tons of different vowels underneath it, right? And some prayers underneath, and a picture, which is really quite interesting. And we'll come back to this picture later too. But you notice here the little boys sitting around the table with their books, right? Studying. And here's an angel, the Sar HaTorah, right? Flying overhead, dropping candies down on them, right? As they study. Here's one student who's not so cooperative, and his teacher has picked a different route to deal with him, not candy, but you notice a little whip there, right? We'll come back to that picture too, right? But all these sort of interest in schooling and learning, and how we teach people both the alphabet and how to remember, right? So it's true, right? Especially for the Hechalot Merkava text, right? That these are situated in a Greco-Roman world, right? And they developed, right? The non-Jewish population developed very sophisticated memory aids, right? Memory practices. But they were actually, one of them, I've had students do this as an experiment, but you've probably may have heard of memory palaces, right? And if you can actually Google memory palaces and get instructions and see how to do it. But the basic idea is you imagine a kind of space, like a palace, or your kitchen, or a house, or just some kind of and you take a chunk of information you need to retain, you break it up into little pieces, and you stash those pieces in different places in space. So if it was something simple like the alphabet, you might say, you come in the door and A is on the doormat. Usually my cat is on the doormat, but we'll say A is on the doormat, right? B might be where you hang up your coat, like C might be where you put your purse down, right? D might be where you carry the groceries, right? And then later, when you need to retrieve that information, you just mentally enter your home and think, oh, A, here's the, here's the doormat, right? B, not, and if you're really good at it, then somebody can say, oh, yeah, well, what happens if you don't come in through the front door? What if you climb through the window? What'd you leave in the window? Maybe K, right? Well, you can start with K, right? And then you can work your way around, and they could actually come down the chimney and go up the basement, right? And move all around space and retrieve information, right? This was really good for people who had to give speeches, right? So, and remember, in the Greco-Roman world, they're great rhetoricians and orators, right? And that was mainly what they used these practices for. And what that means is they didn't need to remember literally the exact wording of things. They needed to remember chunks of ideas, an outline, like what I have written down in front of me now to talk to you, right? They needed to remember, first we're talking about this, and then we're talking about this. They didn't need to have the exact wording. This means that this was not such a great technique for Jewish students, because Jewish students were dealing with what they believed were sacred texts, right? And you couldn't paraphrase. You had to remember them literally, exactly, by rote memory. And so as far as we know, Jewish users never really develop something like the memory palace. The only exception is with the invention of the printing press. You'll know, some of you probably heard some of these stories, right? That every Talmud has the exact same page layout, right? It doesn't matter who prints it, right? So page 16A is the same in every Talmud in the world, right? And you get those, so there is a kind of visual space for content on a page, and that may in fact help students recall things, but they didn't have memory practices. The memory palaces work. I have had students make them, and they do work. But Jewish students in ancient times had to fall back on other options. One was that your average school, if it had, I guess, the money, employed people called a Tana, right? Tanaim. And the Tana was basically like a human tape recorder. The Tana had memorized everything, and you could check your recall against the Tana, right? So he would just spout it out, and you could sort of check and make sure you were accurate. Another thing that Jewish students could do, and you can see this to this day, right, is you can chant as you learn. You can use your body as you learn, right? So that swaying, shuckling, right, moving as you study, right, is also a memory reinforcer, right? And singing or chanting material, right, is also a way of reinforcing memory, right? And we'll mention this again in a few minutes, but those are this sort of embodied memory, right? Is a very strong enhancer of memory. Another set of techniques which we also rely on today, right, is the proper preparation, right? The proper foods, right? I always would ask students, like, so, you're not going to eat like a big bowl of spaghetti before you go take your, GRE, right? They're not going to do it, right? There are certain foods you don't want to have heavy foods, right? There are certain foods that you might think of as enhancing or sharpening your memory, like you could have a protein bar or a chocolate bar, right? Or usually we aim for protein or sugar, right? Or caffeine, right? But we certainly have some idea that certain foods or drugs, right, will enhance memory. Engaging multiple senses, right? So we might not be swaying, but we might be writing things down or reciting them aloud, right? Memorizing things, using acronyms, right? Roy G. Biv, which we all remember, right? And we know that this heightened, the more senses that you pull into remembering things, the better odds are that we'll actually remember, right? And we do this pretty much instinctively, right? The Hechalot, the chariot mystic rituals were often prescribed for Havdalah, right? And Havdalah is interesting because it also uses all those forms, right? So again, we'll see one of these days I'll get this actually right, but oops. Yeah, so I mean, we know, right? There's the spice box, there's the wine, there's the candle, right? There's music, right? So there's light and dark, right? There are all these ways of enhancing memory around this very heightened transition between sacred and secular time, right? And for the early mystics, when they would use these Havdalah moments for ceremonies for their memory rituals, they would also often write, again, angels' names on paper, parchment, and then dissolve it in the Havdalah wine and drink it. Right, so you're sort of drinking the name of the angel, right? And we'll see that the medieval ritual also involves eating text, right? And that becomes a central feature of what's going on, right? And eating words, right? We'll say, I'll eat my words, right? We have some of these expressions still in English, right? Some of these have biblical origin, right? If you remember, Ezekiel eats, God has him write the words down on a scroll, then cut it up and eat it, right? We have expressions in the Bible about God feeding his instruction to Israel, that your learning will be sweet like manna or like honey, right? All of these verses kind of preload these rituals for use, right? They also have curse texts like the Sotah ritual, the adultery ritual, right? Where you write curses on and then dissolve them and make the person drink them, right? So this is a very old idea. And we, of course, also eat words in various forms, right? I always try to think of a bigger list than the one I've come up with, but certainly we have foods that have words on them. And I remember years ago, many years ago, when one of my uncles sort of went on a religious bender and he sent his kids to my cousins to this very religious summer camp, and they were told they weren't allowed to eat Nabisco cookies on Shabbat because breaking the words was considered a tearing, which is forbidden on the Sabbath. So we certainly have, now this is branding, right? But this is, look, you don't eat the actual fortune, but this idea that somehow that there are words that you're consuming that have some value, right? Pills, right? Prescription pills often have something written on them, right? Those little Valentine candies, right? The little hearts that always say have something, right? And the idea is you eat that candy, you're eating that essence, right? We have we have our own versions of this alphabet soup, right? Another one, right? But how this played out in the Middle Ages, which is really what I want to kind of keep my focus on for the rest of this talk, is really quite beautiful. I guess, Laura, we'll go back to my text and see if we can scroll down to exactly how this works. Yeah, can we go down? Okay, yeah, see where it says 3? This is the earliest known description of this ceremony, right? And it, I don't know, you kind of are falling into it not in the very beginning, but the idea, right, this is from the Rokeach, Eliezer ben Judah, right, of worms, right, and it's in Marcus, right, and he says they take the little boys when they turn 5 not during Havdalah. This now has become a Shavuot ceremony, right? So on the morning of Shavuot at sunrise, they take the little boys, they cover them up, right? So he's covered. And the Rokeach says, so he won't see a Gentile or a dog. Well, who knows, right? But it's also, I think it's also a kind of birth symbolism, right? He's going to be moved from his mother, right, from the home, to the synagogue. And this is a time in Jewish life in Ashkenaz when we see, in fact, a lot of Jewish rituals move from private space, home space, to public space, and this is one of them. So, well, you might like earlier, you might have just been taught the alphabet at home in the kitchen, right? Here you're being carried by your father, so you're being removed from your mother, right? Covered to the synagogue, right? And then sat in the lap of your teacher. And the teacher, and then they give you all these verses to justify that, right? And if you scroll down a little further, you see, I know it was kind of hard lining this up, but they bring over a luach, right? So usually the way they didn't have pads like we do, right? They would have a slate, a kind of etch-a-sketch thing. The slate would be a wood board, and it was usually coated with wax. So you could write on it the wax with a stencil, then you could scrape it off, right? And write more, right? So they bring over the luach, and they've written the alphabet on it, right? Forwards, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, right? Backwards, right? Tav, Shin, Resh, Kush, right? Kuf, right? And then they write a verse, right? When Moses charged us with the Torah, right? May the Torah be my occupation. Vayikra Adonai el Moshe, right? The beginning of Leviticus, which is the first biblical book that children will study. And then the teacher recites each letter and the boy recites them back. And then they go backwards and he recites every letter backwards. And then they do a leapfrog, right? Like A, Z, B, Y, right? It's called Atbash, right? And recite all that. Then he recites the verse and the child recites after that. And then he puts honey on the letters and covers the letters with honey, and the child licks the honey off the letters. After that, they bring a cake, right? And the cake has been kneaded with honey, and they've written on the cake, right, on the Morse verses, right? And the teacher recites every word, and the child repeats them, and then they bring over a hard-boiled egg, right? And the egg has been peeled, and they have written on the egg from the book of Ezekiel 3:3, right? Mortal, feed your stomach and your belly with this scroll that I give to you. And Ezekiel says, I ate it, and it tasted as sweet as honey to me, right? And the teacher recites that verse, and the child repeats it, and then he eats the egg and the cake, right? And you saw that picture on the cover of Marcus's book, right? And we'll go back to it in a second. But if you scroll down a little more, you'll see this is from the Sefer Raziel, which is really more a magical compendium of unknown date, but known in Ashkenaz and used there, right? And we get another description of this kind of memory cake, right? And again, for the eve here for Sivan and Shavuot, right? You eat it on Shavuot. They tell you to use barley flour if you can. And then you have to make sure you're pure and ritually clean before you start cooking, right? And you say these prayers, right? I've made this for so-and-so. This is to help him study, right, and not forget anything. And if you scroll a little more, any of you who actually wants to try and construct one of these cakes, here you have your instructions. You need the dough. I did it, by the way, every year that I taught this course, but and I brought it into class. But it's not so, yeah, well, okay. So you make I used a honey cake recipe, but you make the cake and you write these verses inside the dough, right? And then in my case, I waited till it cooked, but I think they have a more bready kind of cake here. They make lines and write these angel names in between the lines on top of the cake, right? And then you bake it. And then you take these leaves and you put all these angel names on things, right? So there's a whole development of the ritual, and then you eat it, right? And it's very good for your memory, right? I actually never proved that to my students. I would make them eat their egg and cakes and then test their memory before and after, but we never had any very conclusive results. But it's quite a beautiful ritual, right? And you'll notice that the foods which are described elsewhere in Jewish texts, even the Talmud, right, as good or bad for memory, right? Eggs, right? Pure protein, right? Right? Baked bread, right? The Talmud tells us there are other kinds of foods that are bad for memory, usually onion, garlic, olives, right? They also will say food that has been nibbled by a rodent you should avoid. It's bad, it'll make you forget things, right? And some of it kind of dovetails with our own like preference for protein and sugar, right? But some of it is hard to explain, right? And for Marcus, right, he emphasizes the way the ceremony performs notions of liminality, right? And I'm going to try and wrap this up very quickly now, right? Of moving a child through spaces, right, between one world and the next, right? So from the domestic female sphere to the male, right, school, synagogue sphere, a kind of birth ritual where he's covered and then uncovered and brought to the water, right? And this is the honey on the slate, right? And if you remember that nice slide of that with the teacher chasing the kid with the whip, right? This is my research assistant, my cat is now coming to help. There's a saying that goes with that picture, which is, first we entice the child, then we use the strap, right? I mean, but this idea that this moment of becoming a student, of learning to read, marks you are going through a portal into a new world, right? It's a new space. Marcus also emphasizes in the Ashkenazi context that this is the use of the cakes and the eggs. And if you think of that, the mark of his book cover with the child holding that round cake and the egg, right? Is a kind of Hanukkah bush moment, right? It's a pushback against Christian symbols like Easter eggs and communion wafers, right? And it's a kind of, we got our own version of this too, right? And by the end of the Middle Ages, this ritual pretty much disappears. The emphasis, the sort of sweetness piece sticks around, as I recall from my first day of Hebrew school, right? And Marcus thinks that the change had to do with changing Christian. So the big culture, the outside culture, is really undergoing changes in its attitudes toward child consent, right? What you can do with little children, and correspondingly in the Jewish world, you will see a shift in emphasis from that 5-year-old, right, to bar mitzvah. And what remains of the medieval initiation, school initiation, is really just that idea of using sweets to convey a sense of learning as sweet, right? And And I'll say this as a way to conclude, right? I think I've taught some version of this topic for over 20 years. And I have always asked my students if they remember their first day of school. And almost never has a student said yes. Now, it may be generational, but I do remember my first day of school. And I also remember my first day of Hebrew school because the teacher taped candies to the alphabet book. And in contrast, when I ask students, what about graduation? Right? You get a totally different reaction, right? And the contrast was illuminating to me, and there's that kind of meta step that we take, right? Because it so vividly illustrates the difference between Jewish learning as something that never ends. It's magnificent when we start, right? And it never ends, right? And our secular culture, right, has a very different model of pedagogy and education, which is that the goal is to get to the end, right? And then go on to real life, right? But for in a sort of in the Jewish microcosm, there is no end, right? And there is no graduation. As for the memory magic, the eggs and the cakes, right? Did they actually work? Well, you know, we have analogs today. We head for caffeine, sugar, protein, right? We use multiple senses to remember things. Some people try drugs, right? There's a slide in my PowerPoint on study drugs, right? Which have become very, very popular. And medieval physicians also like were very interested in how memory worked, right, and how they thought it worked, right. And you can see some fabulous in medieval manuscripts pictures of brains, like their idea of how the brain worked. But I think I will show you this, and then I'll just finish up. But you can see I don't know why my little pointer doesn't like this. All right, it's the black thing that's not, I'm getting tangled in your banner. That's the problem. I can't get to my slideshow.
Okay, I'm gonna get rid of it. And
It's, yeah, the banner is over my,
yeah, I see. Hmm.
you can just, it's really just, oh, well, maybe this is good enough. Can people see this? If I, is that seeable, or do I have to hit share again? I am sharing. Well, here you see a medieval, this is a medical manuscript, right? It's a Hebrew translation of an 11th century tractate on called On the Book, right? A treatise on forgetting and what engenders memory, right? So very beautiful, right? Sephardic script. So this is like a formal medical approach, right? And so whether you're in the synagogue, whether you're in the Beit Midrash, right, whether you're in the doctor's office, right, people are trying to figure out how it works. And all of those sort of highfalutin ideas have a way, whether they're coming from mystical circles or medical men, they can trickle down to the general population. And I think at the last text I gave, I won't even waste your time looking at it now, but the last text in your text packet you'll see is from the Sefer Hasidim, right, a 12th century compendium from Ashkenaz, and it has some 13th century additions, including this piece that I gave you. And in that little anecdote, right, that I have taken from there, right, a man, just a common man, right, clearly not a scholar, goes to his rabbi in a panic, and he says, a mouse, right, ate some of my cheese, and I'm hungry, right? Can I eat from the cheese? Because I know that if I eat from that cheese that a mouse has nibbled on, I'll forget my learning, right? He somehow has some retention of somebody has told him this stuff, right? And the teacher, the rabbi, says to him in great disgust, he says, all day long, you waste your time with your buddies, hanging out, doing nothing, right, worthwhile. He says, it wouldn't hurt you to forget some of the things that you're doing all day long, right? Go right ahead. What are you worried about? But we have wonderful, in this very funny story, evidence of this sort of this knowledge kind of permeating the society. So there's so much more you could say about this topic, but I'm going to stop. And I'll just stop and hope that you remember this little boy licking his honey off his slate and learning the alphabet, because learning begins and should begin with sweetness, and learning should never end. And that's the meaning that matters. So let us go and do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was great. So I'll just mention one thing while I ask people if they can either raise their hand so we can call on you if you have a question, or you want to put something in the chat, feel free. I was the director of a religious school for a number of years, and on the first day of religious school every year, we'd read this story about kids coming and the whole story about the honey. And then we would give them Hershey's Kisses because I wasn't going to give honey and bread and whatever, too messy. and you know, so that was a way to start. But you're right, when we graduate the kids or we move them on to the next level of learning, we don't really, you know, a lot of schools of religious schools, after school programs, have gotten away from the graduation because they're sort of giving the kids the message that we want you to continue learning. So we're not going to have this gigantic big celebration in that respect. So yeah. Anyway, if people have some comments or some questions, I'll just reiterate, people are asking about the recording of today's session will be sent out to everybody that registered, as well as the copy of the text that the doctor referred to as well. And people had asked about recordings of previous sessions. Send us an email at adultlearning@hebrewcollege.edu and we can follow up with you individually. But we do have recordings of previous sessions. From what I saw in there was one question that I did see in the chat.
And also, I think Mark Beal has
Oh,
his.
Mark, you're the one that asked it, so please unmute yourself and ask the question. Thank you.
The question was how much of the before medieval and during medieval period were all of these ceremonies magical potions and sayings and rituals influenced by Christianity, either a reaction to it or an imitation of it?
Well,
small question.
No, well, it's actually, no, I think Marcus would say the medieval ceremony very, very much. I think he actually believes that more than I do, but he argues that much of the ceremony is designed as a kind of pushback against very visible Christian symbols. So if you remember, right, like the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, right, that's going to make communion, right, a sacrament, right? So there's a lot of, right at this period, you're seeing a lot of focus on communion and the visibility of the wafer, right? And believing in the wafer and the sacredness of the wafer, right? So he sees the cakes as kind of anti-wafers, right? And the eggs as kind of anti-Easter eggs, right? And he also thinks that just as Jesus is a kind of sacrifice, at, you know, the sort of Easter moment is celebrating that sort of, or is honor, you know, marking the sort of sacrifice and resurrection, that the child is being packaged as a kind of sacrifice. I don't see that at all. But if you look at his book, maybe you will agree with him. But so the medieval ritual very much, right, is responding to cues and in the Christian world. The late antique rituals, not so much, because it's not a Christian world so much, right? It's got other religions in it. So that seems to be more there may be Gnostic factors, right? There may be all kinds of different, things, but it's not particularly concerned with Christianity, no.
Okay, thank you very much. Looks like we've run.
Yeah, and anyone who wants to, I mean, if you want to ask me directly a question, it's susan.einbinder@uconn.edu, right? So please, feel free to, I know I talked a little long, you're welcome to.
Laura, why don't you add that into the chat?
Oh, I
so
will,
people have it. Or you can, Susan. I just want to wrap up today and thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you all for being here and for joining us. I just want to give you a few announcements. Hebrew College has adult learning has courses ongoing all over throughout the year. Some of our courses will begin after the new year and they're already up on the course catalog. More will be posted in the coming weeks. We invite you to check back regularly to see what's in store. Of course, we'll be in touch with you to remind you to register, but feel free to check out our course catalog. In the next couple of weeks, there's a couple of free events that we invite you to attend. Our next Grow session is scheduled for Wednesday, December 18th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. on the West Coast, 9 a.m. on the West Coast. As our days grow shorter, leaning into the light is more important than ever, and we invite you to join Yaakov Ginsburg Schreck, Executive Director of Ruach Community Health, for a session entitled Kabbalah, Darkness and Light, Hanukkah's Season of Balanced Hope. And we'll send you the registration link. Also, we have an in-person author talk and book signing with Joan Liegend, author of a new story collection, Displaced Persons. The book shines a light on Israel and American Jewish life, especially relevant in these times. Liegend is a winner of the Penn New England Book Award and lots of other awards. Books will be available for purchase and signing, and this event will take place at Hebrew College in Newton. And we'll send you the link to RSVP. Once again, thank you for joining us today. We'll send you a follow-up email with the recording and the information that I just shared, plus the information that's been requested from the presentation today. So have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for being with us.